The man didn't knock. He kicked the door open so hard the hinges screamed, and the woman inside barely had time to press herself against the wall before he stepped through. Broad-shouldered, silver-haired, wearing the kind of suit that cost more than most families earned in a year. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her hands. "Where is it?" His voice was the quiet kind of dangerous, the kind that didn't need volume because it had never once been ignored. Evelyn Mercer held her breath. She had run from men like this for 4 years, across 6 states, through 2 winters that nearly killed her. She had burned her name, her past, and almost every piece of herself just to stay one step ahead of the organization he worked for, and they had found her anyway. "You don't have it," he said, scanning the room. "But you know where it is." She said nothing. That was the only weapon she had left. If you've ever asked yourself what you would do, if everything you ever trusted collapsed in a single night, and the only thing standing between you and people with unlimited power was something you could hold in 2 hands, then you already understand Evelyn Mercer better than she understood herself. Before we go further into her story, if tales like this one reach something in you, stories about ordinary people pushed past their limits who still choose to stand, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Drop your city or country in the comments. This story has already traveled farther than I ever imagined, and I want to know how far it still has to go. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The train arrived in Silver Hollow 40 minutes late, which suited Evelyn fine. Late arrivals drew less attention. The passengers who spilled onto the platform were too busy stretching their legs and complaining about the dining car to notice a single woman stepping down with a worn canvas suitcase and no one waiting for her. Evelyn had learned to move through crowds the way water moved through gravel. Not around, not against, just through, quietly, leaving almost nothing behind. She stood on the platform for a moment and let the town settle around her. Silver Hollow, Montana. Population somewhere between 300 and not enough. The summer of 1887 had baked the main street to a pale, dusty gold, and the heat sat on everything like a second skin. 2 saloons, a general store, a land office with fresh paint that looked wrong against everything else, a church with a bell that hadn't been hung yet, just sitting in the dirt beside the front steps like someone had gotten tired of the work halfway through. It wasn't much. That was exactly what she needed. She had chosen it off a map 6 weeks ago, sitting in a rail station in Cheyenne with her hat pulled low and a cold cup of coffee going colder beside her. She had closed her eyes and put her finger down. Silver Hollow. Small enough to disappear. Far enough from the last place they'd looked. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the main street. The weight of the bag was uneven, heavier on one side than the other, and she adjusted her grip the way she always did, the way that had become automatic after 4 years of carrying it. The journal was wrapped in oilcloth and tucked beneath a false bottom she'd built herself out of plywood and thin tin sheeting. It wasn't elegant work, but it had survived 3 searches, 2 floods, and a fire that had taken everything else she owned. She wasn't ready to think about what was in it. Not yet. Not until she had 4 walls and a door that locked. The woman at the general store counter had the kind of face that remembered everything and forgot nothing. Her name, Evelyn would learn later, was Dottie Crane, and she had lived in Silver Hollow for 31 years, buried 2 husbands, and kept a mental ledger of every stranger who had passed through since the town got its first post office. "Just arrived?" Dottie said, not looking up from the bolts of calico she was sorting. "Yes, ma'am." "Alone?" "Yes, ma'am." Dottie looked up then. She had pale gray eyes that moved like they were taking inventory. "We don't get many women through here alone. Usually they're meeting someone." "I'm looking for work," Evelyn said. "Domestic work. Cooking. Housekeeping. I have references." She had written the references herself, in 3 different handwriting styles, on paper she'd aged with cold tea. It was one of the first things she'd learned. Not how to fight. Not how to run. How to build the paperwork of a person who didn't exist. Dottie set down her calico. "What kind of work have you done?" 6 years with a family in Missouri. Before that, 3 years in a hotel kitchen in St. Louis. The lies came out clean and smooth. She hated that. "Well," Dottie leaned on the counter, "there's not much call for that in town. Most households manage their own. But there is one place." She paused in a way that felt deliberate. "Blackthorn Valley Ranch." Evelyn kept her face neutral. "I haven't heard of it." You wouldn't have if you just got off the train. But you'll hear about it. Everybody does, eventually. Dottie folded her hands. Grant Walker owns it. Biggest operation in the territory. Maybe in the whole northern half of Montana, if you believe what people say. And most people say plenty. 20,000 acres, maybe more. Cattle enough to feed half the state. He built it himself, starting from 160 acres his father left him that wasn't worth much to anyone. And he needs a cook? He needs something. The last housekeeper left in April. Before her there were 2 others in as many years. Nobody stays. She said it plainly, without relish, like it was a fact she'd long since stopped finding interesting. He's not a cruel man. People will tell you that. He's just difficult, cold. Since his wife died, he's let the house go to nothing. The ranch runs fine. The house is a different story. Evelyn thought about that. A wealthy man with a neglected household who couldn't keep domestic help. In her experience, that usually meant one of 3 things. He was a drunk, he was violent, or he was the kind of sad that made everyone around him uncomfortable. None of those were disqualifying, exactly. She had dealt with worse. How do I get there? She asked. The road to Blackthorn Valley Ranch was 11 miles of hard-packed dirt that wound up through scrub pine and open grassland before dropping into a wide valley that looked, on first sight, like someone had drawn it rather than found it. The proportions were too good. The way the hills curved around it, the way the creek ran straight along the eastern edge, the way the main house sat at the center of the valley floor like it had grown there rather than been built. Evelyn rode out on the supply wagon with a man named Cleet, who drove for the general store twice a week and talked without stopping for the entire 11 miles. She learned about Grant Walker's herd sizes, his fencing disputes with a neighboring operation, the names of his 6 permanent ranch hands, the story of how he'd won 300 acres in a card game in 1881, and the general consensus of Silver Hollow regarding the likelihood of him ever remarrying. "Folks say he won't," Cleet said cheerfully. "Say he put everything he had into that woman, and when she went, there wasn't anything left to give. That's what folks say." "What do you say?" Evelyn asked. Not because she particularly cared, but because asking questions kept people talking, and people talking meant they weren't asking questions back. Cleet thought about it. "I say a man who tends his land the way he does hasn't given up on everything. He just doesn't know how to tend anything that isn't land." He shrugged. "But what do I know? I drive a supply wagon." She saw the main house from a quarter-mile out. 2 stories, built from pine logs chinked with white mortar, with a wide front porch that ran the full length of the structure. It would have been impressive if it hadn't looked so tired. The porch railing had a broken section. The kitchen garden beside the eastern wall had gone to weeds. 2 of the window shutters hung at angles that suggested they'd been like that long enough that no one noticed anymore. The house looked exactly like what Dottie had described, a place that worked as a structure but had stopped working as a home. Cleet pulled the wagon to a stop near the side entrance and climbed down to unload. Evelyn got off with her suitcase and stood for a moment looking at the front door. It opened before she reached it. The man standing in the doorway was not what she'd expected, which she acknowledged was her own fault for expecting anything. Grant Walker was taller than average, lean in the way that came from decades of physical work rather than anything deliberate, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had been weathered into something that had long since stopped caring whether it was handsome. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and held a coffee mug in one hand. He was looking at her with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was also not particularly welcoming. It was the expression of a man who had learned to wait before making assessments. "You're the woman Dottie sent word about," he said. Not a question. "Evelyn Mercer." "Yes." He looked at the suitcase, then at her. "You have references?" She pulled them from her coat pocket and held them out. He took them without moving from the doorway, read them quickly, and handed them back. "Missouri and St. Louis," he said. "Yes." "Long way to come for cook's work in Montana." "I wanted a change," she said. It was the answer she'd prepared, and it was vague enough to be almost true. He looked at her for another moment. Whatever he was measuring, he either found it sufficient or gave up measuring it. "Kitchen's through the back. You'll see what needs doing. It's not a short list. Meals for 7, sometimes 8 when the seasonal hands are here. I eat at 6 in the morning, noon, and 7 in the evening. I don't have rules about much else." He stepped back from the doorway. "Rooms above the kitchen. Small." "That's fine." He nodded and turned back into the house. She had the distinct impression he'd forgotten she existed before she even crossed the threshold. The kitchen was worse than she'd imagined, which took some effort given how low she'd set her expectations. It wasn't dirty, exactly. Someone had kept up with the basic surfaces. But it had the particular kind of disorder that came from people doing the minimum for long enough that the minimum had become the standard. The pantry was disorganized in ways that cost time and money. The stove needed a thorough cleaning of its flues. 3 of the 6 burner grates were cracked. The root cellar below the trap door in the corner was damp in a way that would eventually ruin everything stored there, if it hadn't already. She stood in the middle of it for a full 2 minutes, cataloging. Then she set her suitcase in the corner, put on the apron she found hanging on a hook by the door, and went to work. The first meal she made was simple: salt beef with roasted turnips and bread from flour she had to sift twice because something had gotten into the bag. She sent it out to the dining room at exactly 7 o'clock and waited. The ranch hands came in first. They sat down without much ceremony, and she watched through the pass-through as they served themselves. There was one man with a red beard who looked at the food with something approaching suspicion before taking a bite. His face changed. He took another bite. "Better than Tuesdays," she heard him say. "Better than anything since Mrs. Hollis left," said another man. Grant Walker came in last, sat at the head of the table, served himself, and ate without comment. He didn't complain. He didn't compliment. He finished what was on his plate, refilled his coffee himself from the pot she'd left on the sideboard, and left. She told herself that was fine. 3 days passed before she found the notebook. It was tucked on a shelf in the kitchen behind a row of canning jars. A small composition book with a water-stained cover, filled with the cramped, careful handwriting of someone who had been keeping track of household inventory with near-obsessive precision. Flour counts, firewood, candle tallow. Every purchase, every use, every waste. The last entry was dated April 3rd, 4 months ago. She stood there holding the notebook, and something in her chest moved in a direction she wasn't expecting. This was the kind of record a person kept when they cared enough to track the small things. Whoever had kept it, the housekeeper who'd left, she assumed, had cared very much about this house. She turned to the last page and found a note, written in the same hand but shakier, like it had been written in a hurry or a state of distress. "Tell Mr. Walker the Western Boundary Survey is wrong. I heard them talking. The numbers don't match what he was told. He needs to know before it's too late." She stared at that for a long time. Then she put the notebook back where she'd found it. That was a problem she hadn't arrived with, and she had enough of her own. She met Noah on the 5th day. She'd been told about him. Clete had mentioned him on the wagon ride out. Something about Grant Walker's nephew, 9 years old, parents gone to fever the previous winter. But she hadn't seen him yet. The ranch hand said he spent most of his time in the barn or up in the hills with one of the older hands named Rupert, who was patient enough with children that several of the men suspected it was his primary skill. She was in the kitchen garden, pulling the worst of the weeds from between what turned out to be a surprisingly determined row of carrots, when she heard someone in the grass behind her. She turned slowly. A boy was sitting against the garden fence, watching her with the particular expression of a child who had learned not to get invested in new adults. He was small for his age, or maybe just looked it because he sat with his knees pulled to his chest, taking up as little space as possible. "You're the new cook," he said. "I am. You're Noah." He looked at her steadily. "The last one didn't stay." "I heard that." "The one before her didn't either." He picked at the fence slat beside him. "Uncle Grant says people have their own lives, and it's not something to take personally, but he says it in a way that sounds like he does take it personally." She turned back to the weeds. "What do you think of the carrots?" A pause. "What do you mean?" "Someone planted these. They're doing well considering. I'm wondering if it was you." Another pause, longer. "Mrs. Hollis and me. She showed me which ones to thin." "She knew what she was doing," Evelyn said. "These are healthy plants. You want to help me clear around them?" He didn't answer immediately, but a minute later, he was on his knees beside her, pulling weeds without being told twice. The first real conversation with Grant Walker happened on the 9th day, and it started the way most important conversations do. Not because anyone planned it, but because the circumstances didn't leave room for avoiding it. She had been up since 4:30 dealing with a problem in the root cellar. The damp she'd identified on the first day had gotten into the potato stores, and she'd been pulling and sorting for 2 hours, salvaging what could be saved and cutting away what couldn't. She had a basket of good potatoes and a pile of ruined ones and mud on her arms past the elbow when she heard the door open and Grant Walker came down the ladder. He stopped when he saw her. "What happened?" he said. "Moisture's been coming in through the eastern wall since at least spring. Whoever built the drainage around the house didn't account for the water table change when the eastern pasture was cleared." She sat back on her heels. "You've lost about a third of your potato stores. I've salvaged what I can. The rest needs to go." He looked at the pile of ruined potatoes. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name precisely. Not anger, but something adjacent to it. "That's 6 months' worth." "I know. You'll need to buy in for winter. The general store will have them, but the price will be higher than what you grew." She paused. "The wall needs repointing. If you do it now, you can save the rest of what's in storage." He crouched down and picked up one of the bad potatoes, turned it over in his hands. The hollow, softened rot of it was obvious even in the dim light. "How long have you been down here?" he asked. 2 hours. He put the potato down. "You could have waited. Let me deal with it." "I was already awake," she said. And then, because she'd learned that offering something personal sometimes made people stop looking too closely at everything else. "I don't sleep well in new places." He looked at her. Not the inventory look he'd given her on the first day. Something different. Briefly, genuinely curious. "Neither do I," he said. He helped her carry the good potatoes upstairs, and neither of them said anything else. But the silence between them was a different kind of silence than it had been. The letter arrived on the 12th day. It came with the supply wagon, addressed to the ranch, and the foreman brought it to the house with the rest of the weekly deliveries. Evelyn saw it only because she was in the front hall when he came through, and she happened to look at the return address out of habit. She read all return addresses out of habit, always had, the same way she noted every exit in every room she entered. The return address read, Meridian Land Associates, Billings, Montana. Her hands went cold. She didn't reach for the letter. She stepped back into the kitchen doorway and stood there until the foreman had set it on the hall table and walked out. Meridian Land Associates. She knew that name. She had known that name for 4 years, since the night she'd found the journal in her employer's desk in a house in Kansas City, and understood what she was looking at. The same name appeared in the journal's pages 17 times, attached to property surveys that didn't match the land they described, to payments made to county recorders and federal land officers, to the names of ranch families who had lost their properties to boundary disputes that should have been won. And now that name had sent a letter to Blackthorn Valley Ranch. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time. Then she went back to the stove, because supper needed to happen, and she needed to think. And she had always thought better when her hands were busy. The question wasn't whether to say something. The question was what to say, how much to say, and whether she could say it without explaining why she knew what she knew. She didn't have an answer by supper. She didn't have one by the next morning either, Tab. She found her answer in the barn. Not the answer she was looking for. Not about the letter or the journal or what to do next. A different answer, smaller and more immediate, that ended up mattering more in that moment. She had gone out to the barn to ask Rupert, the older hand, about a delivery of firewood that hadn't arrived, and she found Grant Walker instead. He was standing at the far end of the barn next to a mare who was shifting and blowing and clearly distressed, and he had been there long enough that he looked like he'd forgotten that the outside world existed. "She's been like this since morning," he said, without looking up. He wasn't talking to her exactly. He was talking to the air, the way people did when they were thinking out loud. She came up slowly and looked at the mare. "First foal?" "Second. First one was bad." He kept his hand steady on the horse's neck. "I don't know if she remembers or if that's me putting my feelings on her." "Probably some of both," Evelyn said. He glanced at her sideways briefly. They stood there for a while. The mare settled by degrees to, not completely, but enough. When she finally put her head down and blew out a long, shuddering breath, Grant stepped back and let out one of his own. "She'll be all right," he said, more to himself than to her. "Probably." He turned and looked at her directly then, in the full afternoon light coming through the barn door, and she had the sudden, uncomfortable sensation of being seen more clearly than she intended. "You're not what Dottie described," he said. What did Dottie describe? Quiet woman, competent, good with a kitchen. He picked up the currying brush from the post hook. She didn't mention the rest of it. What rest? He didn't answer. He turned back to the mare and began brushing long, steady strokes. She understood she'd been dismissed, not rudely, just done. The conversation had ended where he wanted it to. She walked back to the kitchen, and she was halfway there when she realized he hadn't meant it as an insult. He hadn't been able to articulate what he meant, and instead of fumbling through it, he'd just stopped. She stood in the kitchen doorway and thought about that for a while. It was Noah who changed things, in the way children change things, without warning, without strategy, with the particular effectiveness of someone who doesn't yet know that honesty can be managed. He came into the kitchen late on the 14th evening when everyone else had gone to bed and sat at the kitchen table with the expression of a child carrying something too heavy for his age. "What's wrong?" she asked. He looked at the table. "Nothing." "Noah." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard two men talking at the fence line today. The south fence, where the survey markers are. They didn't know I was there." She set down the pan she was washing. "What did they say?" "They said the line was being moved, that Mr. Hollis over at the adjoining property had filed the paperwork and the county recorder had it." He looked up. "But that's our fence. Uncle Grant put that fence in. I was there when he did it. I was 6. She felt the cold go through her again, the same cold she'd felt in the hall when she'd read the return address. "Did you tell your uncle?" "I tried." He picked at the table edge. "He said survey disputes are common, and he's dealt with them before, and not to worry." He paused. He said it in the voice he uses when he's worried. She dried her hands on a dishcloth and sat down across from him. The journal in her suitcase upstairs suddenly felt heavier than it was. "Noah," she said carefully, "the men you heard at the fence, did they say anything else? A name or a company?" He thought about it. "One of them said something about a land company. I couldn't hear all of it, but part of it sounded like—" He frowned, concentrating. "Meridian." Something about Meridian. Evelyn Mercer sat very still. Outside, a nightbird called once and went quiet. Inside, a decision she had been trying not to make for 14 days made itself. She looked at Noah's face, the worry in it, the trust, the particular way a child looked at an adult when they needed someone to not pretend everything was fine. "Go to bed," she said. "Let me think about this." He looked at her for a moment, assessing in the way children assessed, not with experience, but with instinct. Then he nodded and got up and went. She sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The journal had followed her for 4 years. She had told herself it was protection, that if anything happened to her, the evidence in those pages would outlast whatever the men hunting her could do. But sitting there in the kitchen of a house that was just barely starting to feel like it might become something, she understood what she hadn't let herself understand before. She hadn't been carrying the journal to protect herself. She had been waiting for the moment it could actually do what it was meant to do. She just hadn't known, until tonight, what that moment would look like. She pushed back from the table, climbed the stairs to her small room above the kitchen, and put her hand on the worn canvas suitcase that held everything she had left. Outside, somewhere in the dark valley of Blackthorn Ranch, a horse moved in its stall, and the summer night pressed close and warm against the walls of the house. Tomorrow, she decided, would be the day things changed. Whether that was going to save her or destroy her, she honestly didn't know. She didn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed above the kitchen with her hand flat against the suitcase beside her and listened to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds. The horses shifting, the distant creak, the occasional creak of the house timbers cooling after the day's heat. And she thought about the notebook she'd found behind the canning jars, and the letter with the Meridian return address, and Noah's face when he told her what he'd heard at the fence line. She thought about the journal. She had opened it so many times in 4 years that she could have described its contents from memory without touching it. 114 pages in a dead man's handwriting detailing a scheme that had been running for at least a decade. Property surveys filed with falsified measurements. Payments to county recorders in 6 territories. A network of lawyers, land agents, and surveyors who worked together to move boundary lines on paper until the ranchers who held those lands either sold at disaster prices or lost everything to legal challenges they couldn't afford to fight. The organization called itself various things in various counties. In the journal, it was always referred to by a single phrase, the Meridian Interest. Her former employer, a land attorney named Horace Vane, had been one of their men. She had not known that when she took the position as his household manager in Kansas City. She had not known it for the 8 months she worked in his house, organized his correspondence, managed his domestic staff, and occasionally helped him sort papers when his own clerk was ill. She had known it for approximately 4 minutes on the night she went into his study to retrieve a file he'd asked for and found, tucked inside the file folder, a set of documents that made her stop breathing. She had taken the journal from his desk drawer and walked out of the house with her suitcase and her 3 months' wages and not stopped moving for 6 weeks. Vane had died 4 months later, a riding accident, the newspaper said. She had never been sure whether it was an accident or a message. Either way, it hadn't slowed the men who came looking for what he'd kept. She turned onto her back and stared at the ceiling. Blackthorn Valley Ranch, 20,000 acres, one of the largest operations in northern Montana. And the Meridian Interest had sent a letter to it, and a man named Hollis had filed survey paperwork on the south boundary, and 2 of their men had stood at Grant Walker's fence discussing moving a line he'd put in the ground when his nephew was 6 years old. She had known, intellectually, when she found that return address. She had simply refused to let herself know it. They weren't here because of her. Not yet. She had been careful enough for long enough that her trail here was cold. They were here because Blackthorn Valley Ranch was exactly the kind of property they targeted. Large, valuable, successful. A single owner without family backing or legal networks. A man who had built something from nothing and therefore had nobody who would automatically rally to his defense when the paperwork started looking wrong. Grant Walker was not a random victim. He was a chosen one. She closed her eyes. By the time the first gray light came through the window, she had made herself a promise. She would watch, and she would wait, and she would understand the full shape of what was being done before she said anything to anyone. Because revealing what she knew meant revealing how she knew it. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Morning came the way it always did at Blackthorn Valley, abruptly, with noise. The ranch hands were up before sunrise, and the sounds of the barn and the yard started filtering up through the kitchen floorboards, while the sky was still more purple than blue. Evelyn was already at the stove. She had learned in her first week that the rhythm of a working ranch didn't allow for easing into the day. You were either ahead of it or behind it, and being behind cost everyone. She made biscuits from scratch, a task she'd been doing since she was 12 years old, in a different life that felt like it had happened to someone else. And she had the coffee on and the salt pork frying before the first hand came through the side door. His name was Denny, 23 years old, with ears that stuck out and a disposition so relentlessly cheerful that she'd initially found it exhausting and had now come around to finding it useful. "Morning, Miss Mercer." He poured himself coffee without being invited, which she'd stopped minding 3 days in. "You hear the wagon out at the South Range last night?" She turned from the stove. "What wagon?" "Don't know. One of the night hands said he saw a lantern light out past the south fence around midnight. By the time he rode over to check, there wasn't anything there." He shrugged, took a sip of coffee. "Probably drifters. We get them sometimes in summer." She turned back to the pork. "Was the fence line disturbed?" Denny looked at her, mildly surprised by the specificity. "He didn't check the fence, just checked for people." She nodded slowly, said nothing else. After breakfast, she watched through the kitchen window as Grant Walker came out of the house and crossed the yard to the barn. His gait was purposeful in the way she'd already come to recognize, not hurried but with no waste in it either. He moved like a man who had been solving problems since before most people were awake and expected to keep solving them until after most people went to sleep. She watched him go and thought about the notebook on the shelf and the note written in the last housekeeper's shaky handwriting. "Tell Mr. Walker the western boundary survey is wrong. I heard them talking. Not the south boundary, the western one." Which meant the survey interference wasn't in one place. It was in 2. She found the chance to look at the original survey documents 4 days later, and it was not a proud moment in her history of being a person who respected other people's privacy. Grant Walker had ridden out with 3 of the hands to move cattle to the northern pasture. A full day's work at minimum, probably longer. Noah was with Rupert repairing a fence section on the east side of the property. The remaining 2 hands, Denny and a quiet man named Stokes, were working on a collapsed section of the hay storage roof. Evelyn was alone in the house. She told herself she was looking for the household account books, which she legitimately needed in order to plan the winter provisions. She went to the small office off the main hall, found the account books on the second shelf exactly where she'd expected them, and then stood there for a moment looking at the rest of the shelves. The property files were in a wooden box on the lowest shelf. She could see the tab that said Survey, Original, 1874 in faded ink. She stood there for 30 seconds. Then she took the box out and sat at the desk. The original survey was a careful, professional document, stamped and witnessed and filed with the Territorial Land Office. It described the boundaries of the original Walker property, 160 acres, the father's claim, and then the subsequent acquisitions, each recorded in order, each with its own survey notes and legal descriptions. She spread the documents across the desk and began reading. She found the first problem in 20 minutes, the western boundary. The legal description read correctly at the top of the page, establishing the line at a creek bend that was a natural and obvious landmark. But at the bottom of the page, in a supplemental note that looked like an amendment but wasn't dated, the language shifted. The reference point changed from the creek bend to a survey stake, a portable, movable, removable survey stake, and the language was precise enough to sound official while being loose enough to be challenged. Someone had added that note after the original survey was filed. The handwriting was different. The ink was slightly different in shade. Neither difference would be obvious to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. She set that document aside and found the southern boundary file. The same pattern. Original document clean, correct, unambiguous. Supplemental note added. Different hand, slightly different ink. Changing one reference point from a permanent natural landmark to a survey stake. Two boundaries. Two sets of quietly altered documents. She sat back in the chair and pressed her fingers against her mouth. This was not the work of a neighboring rancher with a boundary dispute. This was the Meridian playbook, step by step, exactly as Horace Vane had described it in the journal she'd been carrying for 4 years. First, the paperwork. Quietly altered, filed early, giving the alterations time to settle into the official record before anyone noticed. Then the survey crew, their own people, moving stakes to match the altered documents. Then the legal challenge, citing the stakes and the filed documents, by which point the original landmarks were long since obscured or disputed. By the time a rancher understood what had happened to him, he was looking at a legal fight that could take years and cost more than the land was worth. She put the documents back in the box exactly as she'd found them, returned it to the shelf, picked up the account books, and left the office. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. She spent the next 3 days paying attention to things she hadn't been watching before. She watched the road. In a week, she counted 4 different riders she didn't recognize passing along the trail that ran through the south end of the property, not stopping, not announcing themselves, but moving in ways that suggested they were looking rather than traveling. One of them stopped for nearly 10 minutes on the ridge overlooking the main house. When she mentioned it to Denny, he said he hadn't noticed. She watched the mail. 2 more letters arrived from Billings addresses she didn't recognize. Grant Walker read them in his office and said nothing to anyone about their contents. She watched Grant himself, and what she saw was a man in the early stages of understanding that something was wrong without yet knowing what it was or how serious it had already become. He was making small changes, spending more time at the boundary lines, having longer conversations with the foreman, sending one of the hands on a ride to Silver Hollow for a reason he didn't share. He was not panicking. He was the kind of man who processed trouble by working harder, not by talking, and so the worry showed only in the length of his days and the set of his jaw at dinner. She served the meals and watched and said nothing, and the thing she was carrying got heavier with every day she didn't put it down. The moment she'd been both waiting for and dreading arrived on a Thursday evening when the summer heat had finally broken and a cool wind was coming down from the north. She was in the kitchen garden, harvesting the carrots that Noah had helped her uncover from the weeds 3 weeks earlier. The boy was sitting on the fence nearby, nominally helping but mostly watching and talking, which she'd come to understand was his way of processing whatever was on his mind. He had been quiet for a while when he said, "Uncle Grant talked to a lawyer today." She kept pulling carrots. "In town?" "He rode over to Henderson Crossing. That's where Mr. Blaine has his office." He paused. "Mr. Blaine is the one Uncle uses for property things." He said he'd be back by supper, but he came back early. He didn't look like supper was on his mind. She set a carrot in the basket. Noah, do you know if your uncle has been contacted by a company called Meridian Land Associates? The boy thought about it. I don't know the name, but there was a man who came to the front door 2 weeks ago. Uncle Grant talked to him on the porch for a long time. Afterward, Uncle came inside and stood in the hall for a while, just stood there. He looked at her. He does that when something is very wrong, just stands somewhere and is very quiet. She understood exactly what that looked like. She had done it herself. The man who came to the door, she said, can you describe him? Noah described him. Medium height, well-dressed, carrying a leather document case. Dark hair with a streak of white at the front that Noah thought looked theatrical, like something from a picture. She knew who that was. Not personally. She'd never met him. But he was in the journal. Thomas Cade, listed as the regional representative of the Meridian Interest, operating out of Billings, specializing in the initial approach to property owners. The polite conversation. The vague survey concerns raised as neighborly advice. The gentle suggestion that the most prudent course was to sell before things became complicated. Gentle suggestions had a way of becoming less gentle once the target understood they weren't really suggestions. What did your uncle say to you afterward? She asked. He said some people weren't worth the time of day and I shouldn't judge the whole territory by a few bad apples. Noah's mouth twisted slightly. He also said I should stay away from the south fence. He never said that before. She put the last of the carrots in the basket and stood up. She had been telling herself she needed more time, more information, a clearer picture of the shape of what was being done before she said anything to a man she'd known for 3 weeks about a criminal conspiracy she was carrying evidence of in a suitcase under her bed. Standing in the garden with a basket of carrots and a boy who'd just told her his uncle was already afraid, she couldn't make that argument to herself anymore. She found him in the barn after supper, the way she'd found him before, in the same spot near the same mare, who had settled now into a calm that the foal beside her seemed to have inherited. He was doing the thing she'd learned was his version of thinking, standing near something alive and doing nothing in particular, just being present enough that the animal didn't startle. I need to tell you something, she said from the barn door. He turned. His face was unreadable in the way it often was, but she'd gotten better at seeing what was underneath the surface of him. And what she saw now was exhaustion. Not physical, the other kind. All right, he said. She came in and stood a reasonable distance from him and said, I know about Meridian Land Associates. I know what they do and how they do it, and I know they're already in the process of doing it to you. I know because I have documents, a journal, evidence that I've been carrying for 4 years. I took it from a man in Kansas City who was part of the organization. They've been looking for me since I left. She stopped. The barn was very quiet except for the sounds the horses made. Grant Walker looked at her for a long moment. Who are you? He said. His voice was level, not accusatory, just asking for real information. I told you my name, she said. Evelyn Mercer is my name. That part is true. The references aren't. My history isn't. But my name is mine. She paused. Everything I just told you is also true. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Why are you telling me now? He said. Because they've already altered your survey documents on at least 2 boundaries. Because a man named Thomas Cade already came to your door. Because your south fence line is being surveilled. She watched his face as she said it and saw the particular expression of someone who had suspected something without wanting to have suspected it, and now had to stop pretending he hadn't. Because Noah told me you stood in the hall for a long time after Cade left, and I know what that kind of standing still looks like. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't name. How do you know what they've done to the survey documents? He said. I haven't told anyone that. I went into your office, she said. I looked at the files. I'm sorry. I needed to understand if what I suspected was already in motion, and it is. She waited for the anger. It was a reasonable thing for him to feel. She had gone through his private papers without permission, had been living in his house under false pretenses, and was now standing in his barn telling him his property was under systematic attack by people who had been hunting her for years. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man doing very fast arithmetic. The journal, he said. How much does it document? Everything. Names, payment records, survey alterations, the properties they've taken. At least 36 ranches across 6 territories, going back 10 years. The organization is larger than anything a single county lawyer could address. He turned away from her and looked at the mare for a moment. The foal shifted beside its mother, and the sound it made was the smallest, most ordinary thing. A foal settling, nothing more. And yet it seemed to change something in the air between them. When he turned back, his face had resolved into something more like the man she'd been watching for 3 weeks. The man who did not surrender to problems, who worked at them until they moved. "You said they've been hunting you," he said. "Do they know where you are?" "Not yet," she said. "I've been careful. But if they're already at your property, it's a matter of time before someone connects me to it." He nodded slowly. "Then we don't have as much time as I'd like." He looked at her steadily. "I need to see the journal." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." She brought the journal down from her room while he waited in the kitchen, and she set it on the table between them and watched him read. He was a careful reader. She hadn't expected that, though looking back she should have, because he was a careful man in all things. He read without rushing, going back to check entries against each other, occasionally pausing to look at a particular passage for longer than necessary. He was on the 6th when the kitchen door opened and Noah appeared in the doorway in his nightclothes with his hair sticking up in 4 directions. He looked at the two of them and then at the journal on the table. "Something happened," he said. Not a question. "Go back to bed, Noah," Grant said. "Uncle Grant, I'll explain tomorrow. Go to bed." The boy looked at Evelyn. She gave him the steadiest look she could manage, which she hoped conveyed that the situation was being handled without actually conveying anything, because she honestly wasn't sure yet whether it was. He went. Grant read for another hour. When he finally closed the journal, he put his hand flat on the cover, a gesture that reminded her of the way she'd kept her hand on the suitcase the night before, though she doubted he knew that. "How many people in this county work for them?" he said. "I don't know. The journal names the county recorder in Billings. That's one. The surveyor who handled your western boundary amendment is almost certainly theirs, based on the handwriting comparison. Beyond that, I don't know." "Then we can't go to the county," he said. "No." "Territorial authorities?" "Possibly, but not until we understand how deep it goes. The journal names a territorial land officer in one case, not Montana, but that doesn't mean it couldn't extend here." He sat back and looked at her in the long, considering way he had. "You've been thinking about this for 4 years." "Yes." "And you ended up here." "I put my finger on a map," she said, and heard how inadequate that sounded. "I was looking for somewhere quiet." Something crossed his face, not quite amusement, but in the neighborhood of it. "You found the wrong place." "I think," she said, "I might have found exactly the right one." He looked at the journal again. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man reconsidering several things at once, and not finding any of the reconsiderations comfortable. "I need to think," he said, "and I need you to keep the journal somewhere safer than a suitcase." "I've kept it in a suitcase for 4 years. That was before they knew to look at this address." He stood up. "There's a false panel in the office floor. I built it when I built the house. I don't know why. I just thought it was the kind of thing a man should have." He paused, which might have been embarrassment. "Nobody else knows about it." She looked at him. In the low lamplight, standing on the other side of the kitchen table with one hand still resting on her journal, he looked like what he was, a man who had been carrying his own particular weight for years and had just found out his weight and hers were connected in ways neither of them had planned for. "All right," she said. She picked up the journal and followed him out of the kitchen, and the house around them was quiet, and in the morning nothing would look different from the outside. But the thing between the ranch and the organization that was moving against it had changed tonight in ways that couldn't be undone. That was true of most things that mattered, she had learned. You didn't decide them so much as find yourself on the other side of them, looking back, trying to identify the moment when the deciding had actually happened. She thought it might have been earlier than tonight. She thought it might have been the moment she sat across from a 9-year-old boy in a lamplit kitchen and watched him tell her about 2 men at a fence line and understood that the evidence she'd been carrying for 4 years was not, as she had allowed herself to believe, a burden she was bearing alone. It had always been waiting for the moment it could be used. She was beginning to understand that she had been waiting for that moment too. She just hadn't known it until she stopped running long enough to feel it. Grant Walker opened the office door, crossed to the window, and knelt beside the third floorboard from the left wall. "Here," he said. She came and stood beside him, and the night pressed against the house from all sides. And somewhere beyond the south fence, a line had been moved on paper in a dead man's handwriting. But in this room, in this house, two people who had both learned the cost of carrying things alone were about to put something down together. And that, Evelyn thought, as the floorboard came up and she reached for the journal one last time, was how things actually changed. Not in the moments that looked like turning points, but in the small, irreversible decisions made in quiet rooms when no one was watching. The morning after they hid the journal, Grant Walker ate breakfast without looking at her differently, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. She had half expected something to shift in the way he moved through the house, some acknowledgement, some change in how he occupied the space near her. Instead, he came in at 6, poured his coffee, sat down, and ate the eggs and biscuits she'd made with the same focused, economical attention he gave everything. When he was done, he set his fork across his plate the way he always did. "I'm riding the south boundary today," he said. "All of it. I'll have something cold packed for noon." He nodded and left. That was all. And somehow, that was exactly right. She spent the morning doing what she did every morning, managing the kitchen, organizing the week's provisions, checking the stores. While underneath the ordinary surface of it, her mind was doing something else entirely. She was running through the journal's contents from memory, cataloging what was there and what it could prove and what it couldn't, thinking about the difference between evidence sufficient to understand a crime and evidence sufficient to prosecute one. The journal was devastating as a document of knowledge. Whether it was sufficient as a document of law was a different question, and it was a question she didn't have the expertise to answer. Horace Vane had been a lawyer. She had been a household manager who happened to find her way into a lawyer's files, and her 4 years of running had given her a thorough education in self-preservation, but not in evidentiary standards. What they needed was someone who understood both. She was thinking about this when she heard hooves in the yard. Not Grant returning, it was too early for that. And she looked through the kitchen window and felt her stomach go cold. 3 riders. She didn't know the two in the back, but the man in front she recognized from Noah's description with a precision that made her skin feel wrong. Medium height, well-dressed even on horseback, dark hair with that streak of white at the front that the boy had called theatrical. Thomas Cade sat his horse with the particular ease of a man who had ridden up to a great many front doors and never once been turned away. She didn't move from the window. She watched him dismount and tie his horse to the front post and walk to the front door with his leather document case under his arm. He knocked. She was the only one in the house. She took off her apron, folded it over the back of a chair with hands that were steadier than she felt, and walked to the front hall. She opened the door. Up close, Thomas Cade had a face that had been arranged to project friendliness, the way some walls were arranged to project strength. It was structural rather than natural, the kind of pleasantness that came from long practice. His eyes moved across her once, quickly, and she knew he was doing the same cataloging she was. "Good morning," he said. "I'm looking for Mr. Walker." "He's on the range," she said. "Can I take a message?" "And you are?" "The cook," she said. He smiled. The smile was excellent, warm, regretful, designed to make you feel like he wished circumstances were different. "That's a shame. We have business to discuss. Do you know when he'll return?" "Evening." He tilted his head slightly. Something in his assessment of her had shifted, though she couldn't have said exactly what he'd noticed. "Might I leave a card?" She held out her hand. He produced a calling card from his breast pocket and laid it in her palm. Thomas Cade. Meridian Land Associates, Billings, Montana, established 1879. She looked at it long enough to have read it, which was all she allowed herself. "I'll make sure he gets it," she said. The smile again. "Thank you. Tell him we're very interested in discussing a mutually beneficial arrangement. These boundary questions have a way of becoming complicated if they aren't addressed early." "I'll tell him," she said. She held his gaze. She had learned across 4 years and a dozen close calls that the instinct to look away from dangerous people was exactly the wrong instinct. Looking away said something. Holding still said something else. He was the first one to move. He touched the brim of his hat, turned, and walked back to his horse. She closed the door and stood in the hall with the card in her hand, and her pulse doing something irregular, that she breathed through steadily until it stopped. Grant came back 2 hours earlier than expected, which told her the south boundary had given him something worse than he'd anticipated. She heard the horse in the yard and watched from the kitchen window as he dismounted, and she could read it in the way he was carrying himself, the tight set of his shoulders, the particular way his jaw was working. He'd found the stakes. She had his coffee ready when he came through the kitchen door. He saw it on the table, looked at her, and sat down. She set the card beside the mug. He looked at it for a moment. "He came while you were out," she said. "2 riders with him. He was pleasant. He said to tell you the boundary questions have a way of becoming complicated if they aren't addressed early." Grant picked up the card and held it the way she'd seen him hold the bad potato the month before, like something that had rotted while he wasn't watching. "They moved the stakes," he said, "both sides of the south pasture. By my measurement, they've claimed about 900 acres on that boundary alone." 900? She stopped herself. "It's the best grazing land I have," he said. His voice was flat in the way she'd learned meant he was keeping something tightly controlled. "That's not an accident." "No," she said. "It's not. They identify the most valuable sections first. It's what the journal documents. They don't come for scraps." He set the card down and looked at her. "How long before they move to legal challenge?" "If they're following their pattern, and they always follow their pattern, the survey crew has already completed their falsified measurements. The paperwork gets filed within 30 to 60 days of the stake placement. Once it's filed, you're fighting their version of events on their timeline with their documentation." She sat down across from him. "The journal shows every case they've won. In 23 out of 36 documented properties, the owner received the first legal notice before they even knew a survey had been filed." "So I'm already behind." "You've been behind since before I got here," she said, and then wished she'd found a gentler way to say it. But he didn't look wounded. He looked like a man who needed accurate information and had just received it. "All right," he said. "What do we need?" "We need a lawyer who isn't connected to any county office the Meridian interest might have reached. We need a way to get the journal authenticated, the handwriting, the ink, the paper dating, all of it, so it can stand up to challenge. And we need to understand how large the network is in Montana specifically, because the journal documents 6 territories, but it doesn't cover everything that's happened since Vane died." She paused. "We also need to be careful about who we talk to and in what order. If they find out we have the journal before we've established who we can trust, they will do what they always do." "What's that?" "Make the evidence go away," she said, "and whoever is holding it." He was quiet for a moment. "Blaine can't handle this," he said, meaning his property lawyer in Henderson Crossing. "He's good for deed transfers and grazing agreements. This is something else." "Yes. I know someone in Helena, practiced federal land law before he came west. We went to school together. He's about as far from this county as I can get while staying in the territory." He turned the card over in his hands. "I haven't spoken to him in 4 years. Can you trust him?" He thought about it honestly, which she respected. He didn't say yes immediately the way people did when they wanted to believe something. "I think so," he said. "He's stubborn and he's got a contrary streak that's gotten him into trouble before. But he doesn't like people who cheat." A brief pause. "He really doesn't like it." "Then he's exactly what we need," she said. Grant nodded. He looked at the card again and then put it down in a way that was final. "I'll send word to Helena today." She stood up to go back to the stove. "Evelyn," he said. She turned. "The man who came this morning." He was watching her. "Did he know who you were?" "No," she said. "He thinks I'm the cook." "You are the cook," he said. And there was something in it, not quite dry, not quite warm, that she found herself turning away from before she could figure out what to do with it. She told Noah that evening after supper, while Grant was writing the letter to Helena. She told him in the way she told him most things, directly, without softening it into something that would confuse him more than comfort him. She explained, in terms precise enough to be accurate and simple enough to be useful, that men were trying to take part of his uncle's ranch by filing false paperwork, and that she had documents that showed how they'd done it to other ranches, and that his uncle was going to fight it. Noah listened with his arms folded and his chin slightly down, which she'd come to understand was his thinking posture. "The man in the fancy suit who came last month," he said. "That was them." "Yes." "And the men at the south fence?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Is Uncle Grant going to be all right? I don't know yet, she said, but he's not going to be alone in it. He looked at her. He had his uncle's eyes, the same shade, the same quality of steadiness. And she understood in that moment where the boy had developed his particular ability to make an adult feel assessed. Because of you, he said. Because we're going to figure it out together, she said carefully. He unfolded his arms. Can I help? You already did, she said. You're the one who told me about the men at the fence. He thought about that. Some of the weight in his face eased slightly. Not gone, but redistributed. Okay, he said. Okay. He pushed back from the table. I'm going to go check on the foal. She watched him go and thought about how children move through fear differently than adults. Not around it, not over it, but through it, coming out the other side faster than seemed possible. She had done that once. She had forgotten how. The response from Helena arrived in 11 days, which was faster than she'd hoped. The man's name was Arthur Keene. The letter was 2 pages, written in a hand so cramped it took her several minutes to parse it when Grant read it aloud at the kitchen table. He had stopped pretending that the business of the letter was separate from her, and she had stopped pretending she didn't need to know. Arthur Keene had heard of the Meridian interest. He had heard of it specifically in connection with a federal investigation that had been initiated 2 years ago and then quietly shelved when 2 of the key investigators were transferred and 1 retired. He used the word shelved without elaboration, but the elaboration wasn't needed. She knew what shelved meant when it came to federal inquiries into well-funded criminal organizations. It meant someone had applied pressure at a level where pressure worked. He was willing to come to Blackthorn Valley. He would require the journal. He would require affidavits from anyone who had witnessed the survey interference. And he had a contact, former colleague, he wrote, at the Territorial Land Office in Helena, who he believed was uncorrupted, and who had been, in his words, quietly furious about certain developments in boundary law for some time. Grant put the letter down and looked at her. He's coming. How soon? 10 days, maybe less. He was quiet for a moment. He also says to be careful about the house. He says if they have any indication we're building a case, they'll escalate. She already knew that. She had known it the moment she decided to tell Grant. And she had known it before that, when she'd first recognized the Meridian return address in the hall. The thing about fighting an organization like this was that the moment you stopped being a passive target and started being an active threat, the whole nature of their attention changed. They had been moving on Grant's land slowly, carefully, following their established pattern. The moment they understood someone on this property knew their pattern, knew their names, knew their methods, had 4 years' worth of documentation of both, slow and careful would stop being useful to them. We need to be ready for that, she said. What does ready look like? She thought about it. The journal stays in the floor. The original survey documents should be copied, twice, with the copies stored separately from the originals. If anything happens to this property, the evidence needs to exist in multiple places they don't know about. She paused. And the people here need to know enough to be careful without knowing so much that they become targets themselves. He nodded slowly. He was not a man who liked vulnerability of any kind, and she could see the cost of acknowledging it. I'll talk to the hands. Just the ones you'd trust with your life, she said. Not because the others can't be trusted, but because the fewer people know, the fewer people are at risk. He gave her a sharp look. Not angry, more like recognition. You've thought about this kind of thing before. For 4 years, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, must be exhausting. It was the most personal observation he'd made directly to her since the night in the root cellar. She felt the unexpected weight of it, someone noticing the cost of something she'd long since stopped expecting anyone to notice. It gets easier to carry, she said, which was not the same thing as saying it stopped being heavy. 3 days later, Thomas Cade came back. This time he didn't come to the front door. He came to the barn while Grant was visible in the yard and walked to him directly, in the manner of a man who had decided that pleasantries had been given sufficient time to work, and something more concrete was warranted. Evelyn was at the kitchen window when it happened. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she watched the body language with the attention she'd spent 4 years developing. Cade talked. Grant listened. Cade produced a document from his case and held it out. Grant took it, read it, handed it back. He said something short. Cade said something longer. Grant said something shorter than the first thing. Cade's posture changed. Not dramatically. He was too disciplined for that. But she could see the slight adjustment, the shift from the practiced pleasantness into something underneath it that was not pleasant at all. He put the document back in his case. He left. Grant came into the kitchen 5 minutes later with the expression of a man who had said what needed saying and was now reconsidering whether he'd said it well. He made an offer, Grant said, 14 cents on the dollar for the south pasture. Called it a fair resolution given the survey complications. What did you say? I said there were no survey complications. I said if he set foot on my property again without an invitation, I'd have him removed. He sat down and picked up his coffee, which was cold by then, but he drank it anyway. He said I was making a difficult situation more difficult. That's what they say when the offer is refused, she said. It means the next contact won't be a social call. He set the mug down. How long do we have before they escalate? Days, maybe a week. She thought about Arthur Keene 10 days away. We need Keene here faster. Grant was already standing. I'll send another rider today. She turned back to the stove and then stopped because there was something she'd been circling around for the past 3 days that kept not finding its way out, and she understood now was as close to the right moment as she was going to get. Grant, she said. He stopped at the kitchen door. I need you to understand something. She turned around. When this escalates, and it will, they will find out about me. They have people in enough places that once they start looking seriously at this property, my name is going to come up. The moment it does, the focus shifts. You, your property, the case we're building, all of that becomes secondary to finding me and what I'm carrying. He was watching her steadily. I can leave, she said. I've done it before. I can take the journal copies and go somewhere they'll have to start overlooking, and you can fight them on the land case alone without the added complication of, no, he said. She stopped. The journal is what makes this winnable, he said. Without it, I have a lawyer from Helena and some mismatched ink on a document that Meridian's lawyers will bury under 6 months of motions. He held her gaze. And you're the one who knows how to use it. I'm also the reason they'll come harder. They were already coming hard, he said. 900 acres on the south pasture alone. They didn't pick this place because it was easy. He shifted slightly in the doorway. You picked the right place to stop running, Evelyn. I'm not going to tell you different. She looked at him for a moment. You're not what Dottie described either, she said. Something crossed his face. What did Dottie describe? She said you were difficult, she said. Cold. He considered that. She's not wrong, he said, with a self-awareness she hadn't expected. Usually. He left the kitchen, and she heard him in the hall picking up his hat and his coat, the sounds of a man with too many things to do and not enough hours. And she stood at the stove thinking about what it meant to stop running. Not to find safety, exactly, but to stop moving long enough to be seen clearly by someone who had decided that what they saw was worth the trouble. She had not been prepared for that to feel the way it felt. Arthur Keene arrived on the 7th day. He was not what she'd imagined from the cramped handwriting and the carefully measured language of his letter. He was short, wide in the shoulders, with a red-brown beard he hadn't trimmed recently, and clothes that suggested he'd left Helena in a hurry, which he confirmed the moment he walked through the front door. I came faster than I said I would, he announced to Grant, but with his eyes moving around the hallway with the alert, cataloging attention of a man assessing a situation. 2 reasons. First, my contact at the Territorial Land Office confirmed that a boundary survey amendment filing was submitted in your name 6 weeks ago for the western pasture. You didn't file it. Grant went very still. Second reason, Keene said, someone in Billings has been asking questions about properties in this county, specifically about this property, specifically about whether anyone new had taken up employment here in the past 2 months. His eyes landed on Evelyn. You'd be Miss Mercer. Yes, she said. Arthur Keene. He didn't offer his hand while he was already turning to Grant. We need to work fast. Where's the journal? What followed was 3 days that Evelyn would later think of as the most concentrated work of her life, and she had lived a life that had not been short on concentrated work. Keene was relentless. He read the journal twice, cover to cover, both times, taking notes in his cramped hand that produced pages of analysis. She couldn't always follow but understood in structure. He asked her questions about Vane, about the night she'd left Kansas City, about every encounter she'd had with anyone connected to the Meridian interest in the 4 years since. He asked her things she hadn't thought about in a long time, and some things she hadn't thought about ever, because there are aspects of your own experience you can't see clearly until someone else is looking at it from outside. On the second day, she sat across from him at the kitchen table for 4 hours while he walked her through the journal entry by entry, asking her to explain what she understood, what she'd inferred, and what she'd found through her own observation since arriving at Blackthorn Valley. She told him about the survey documents in Grant's files, the altered boundaries, the different ink. She told him about the note left by the previous housekeeper. She told him about Thomas Cade's 2 visits and the offer at 14 cents on the dollar. At the end of the 4 hours, Keene sat back and pulled at his beard and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. What? She said. I've been practicing law for 19 years, he said. I've handled federal cases. I've handled land cases. I've handled cases where the other side had resources that made mine look like a child's allowance. He looked at the journal. I have never seen documentation of this quality assembled under circumstances like yours. Do you understand what you've been carrying? Evidence, she said. It's more than evidence, he said. It's a record. It's the kind of record that investigators spend careers trying to build. Vane was meticulous. Whatever else he was, whatever his involvement, he kept track of everything. He looked at her. And you kept track of him keeping track of it. I didn't have a choice, she said. Most people without a choice don't end up doing it this well, he said. She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at the table. The question, Keene said, businesslike again, is what we do with it. Using the journal in a local proceeding is a risk. We don't know how deep the Meridian connection goes in the county or the territory. Using it at the federal level requires establishing a chain of custody and authenticating the document in ways that will take time we may not have. So what do we do? She asked. We do both, he said. Simultaneously. We file an immediate injunction against the fraudulent survey amendments that goes to the territorial court in Helena, where my contact can ensure it reaches a judge who isn't in Meridian's pocket. At the same time, we begin building the federal case using the journal as the foundation. By the time Meridian's legal machinery responds to the injunction, we've established the journal's authenticity and connected it to the Montana operations. He paused. It's aggressive. They're already escalating, she said. Aggressive is what we have. He nodded. There's one more thing. He looked at her directly. You'll need to testify. Not in this county, in Helena, possibly in a federal proceeding, under your real name, about how you came to have the journal, what you understood it to mean, and what you've observed since arriving here. She had known this was coming. She had known it since the night in the barn when she'd decided to tell Grant. Maybe she had known it earlier than that. Yes, she said. I know. You understand what that means. They'll know exactly where you are and what you're doing. They already nearly know, she said. The questions being asked in Billings will become certainty once the injunction is filed, he said. Yes. She looked at the table for a moment. She thought about the notebook behind the canning jars and the note written by a woman who had heard something she shouldn't and tried to warn someone too late. She thought about 36 documented ranches and the families on them. She thought about Noah in the kitchen, telling her about 2 men at the fence, and how she'd looked at his face and understood that she had been waiting for this. Not the right place, not the right moment, but the right reason to stop. Then they know, she said. Grant found her in the kitchen garden that evening, after Keene had retired for the night and Noah was in bed and the ranch had settled into the kind of quiet that felt, these days, more fragile than it used to. She was harvesting the last of the summer herbs, not because she needed them urgently, but because her hands needed something to do while her mind processed what the past 3 days had built into something real and irreversible. He came and stood near the garden fence, not inside it, in the way he had of being present without intruding. Keene told me what you said, he said, about testifying. I know what I agreed to, she said. I'm not questioning it. He was quiet for a moment. I want you to understand that this changes things. What you're doing, putting your name on this publicly, that's not the same as hiding the journal in the floor. I know that. They will come here, he said. They'll come harder than they've come so far, and not just with lawyers and surveyors. You understand that. She stood up and looked at him over the garden fence. The evening light was the particular amber of late Montana summer, and it fell across the ranch yard and the house, and the man standing at the fence in a way that made everything look both more beautiful and more temporary than usual. "I've been running for 4 years," she said. "I know exactly what they're capable of." "Then why?" "Because I'm tired," she said. And then, more honestly, because it's the right thing. Because 36 families lost their ranches and nobody stopped it, and I've had the evidence to stop it for 4 years, and I've been too afraid to stand still long enough to use it. She looked at him steadily. "And because this is the first place I've been in 4 years where I woke up in the morning and didn't immediately think about where I'd go next." Something moved in his face that she'd been starting to learn the vocabulary of. The careful, inexpressive exterior and the particular small shifts that meant the inside was doing something different. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," he said, "or to Noah, or to what we're building here." She noticed the word "we" and didn't say anything about it. "I know," she said. "But Grant, I need you to understand that I'm not staying because of that. I'm not staying because you can protect me." She met his eyes. "I'm staying because I've decided to stop leaving." He looked at her for a long moment, in the amber light, with the horses moving somewhere behind him and the smell of the herb garden around her. And the something in his face settled into something she could finally read clearly. "All right," he said. It was, she thought, the most uncomplicated thing he had ever said to her. And it was exactly enough. She turned back to the herbs. He stayed at the fence for another minute, not saying anything, just present. Then his footsteps moved back toward the house, and she heard the front door, and she was alone in the garden with the last of the summer light, and the decision she'd made in a barn 12 days ago that had been turning into something real ever since. In the morning, Keene would begin drafting the injunction. In a week, it would be filed in Helena, and Thomas Cade would receive a copy, and the men in Billings who had been asking careful questions about this property and its new cook would have their answer. And the thing that had been set in motion 4 years ago in a dead man's study in Kansas City, and again 3 weeks ago in a barn in Montana, and again tonight in a kitchen garden, would stop being something that was coming and start being something that was happening. She finished the herbs and went inside. The floorboard in the office held the journal. The kitchen table held Keene's notes. The ranch around her held its breath. She was not afraid. That was the strangest part, standing at the edge of the most dangerous thing she had ever deliberately chosen, and finding that the fear had not gone away but had changed its character. It was no longer the fear that chased, the fear that kept her moving at night, and studying exits and building paper histories for women who didn't exist. It was the other kind, the kind that came from choosing something rather than being driven to it. She understood, standing in the kitchen of Blackthorn Valley Ranch with mud on her boots and herbs in her hand, that there was a difference between being brave and being done with running. She was not sure yet which one she was, but she was at last going to find out. The injunction was filed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Blackthorn Valley Ranch was on fire. Not all of it. They were not that bold, not yet. It was the South Hay Storage, the large barn-like structure that sat 300 yards from the main house, the one that Denny and Stokes had been repairing the roof of back in the weeks when everything was still quiet. It went up fast, the way dried summer hay always did, and the smell of it reached the house before anyone saw the light. Grant was out of bed and across the yard before Evelyn had finished pulling on her boots. By the time she got to the kitchen door, the hands were already forming a line from the water pump, passing buckets in the dark, with the practiced efficiency of men who had trained for this without being told to. The fire had taken the roof and was working on the walls. There was nothing to save inside. The hay was gone the moment the fire found it. So the work was containment, keeping the burning structure from spreading to the fence line and from there to the summer dry grass of the south pasture. She stood in the yard and watched, and felt something settle into place in her chest that was not calm, exactly, but was close to it. The cold, functional clarity that came when she'd already known something was coming, and it finally arrived. Noah was at her elbow. She hadn't heard him come out. "Stay here," she said, before he could move toward the fire. "I can help." "Stay here," she said again, not harshly, and put her hand briefly on his shoulder. "Watch the road. Both directions. Can you do that?" He understood. She could see it in the way his posture changed, responsibility replacing the impulse to run toward the fire. Yes, he said. Tell me if anyone comes that you don't know. She left him on the porch and went to find Keen. I was in the office. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open and found him at the desk with a lamp burning and papers spread in front of him, which meant he'd either not been asleep when the fire started or he'd come here before going outside, which told her something about the shape of his mind. It's the South Hay storage, she said. I know. I heard. He didn't look up from the papers. They work fast. They always do, once they've decided to escalate. She came to the desk. The injunction reached them faster than we thought. Or someone told them it was coming before it arrived. He finally looked up. His face in the lamplight was doing the same thing she imagined her own face was doing, assessing, recalibrating, not panicking, but not pretending either. We may have a communication problem. She sat down across from him. Who knew about the filing before it was submitted? Grant, you, me, my contact in Helena. He pulled at his beard. And whoever my contact told, if he told anyone, which I'd like to believe he didn't, but I've been practicing law long enough to know that belief and fact are different things. Is your contact reliable? He was the last time I needed to rely on him, which was 8 years ago. Keen spread his hands. People change. Situations change. The Meridian interest has had years to put money in the right places. She was quiet for a moment. So we operate as if the filing is known. What does that mean for the Helena proceeding? It means we accelerate. The judge has the injunction. The question is whether she'll act on it or whether there will be procedural delays that conveniently allow Meridian time to get ahead of us. He started stacking his papers. I need to go back to Helena. Now? Tomorrow morning. Tonight, if Grant can spare a horse and the dark doesn't kill me on the road. He looked at her. I need to be in front of that judge before anyone else is, and I need to bring her something more than the injunction. The journal, she said. A certified copy. The original stays in the floor. He paused. And I need a statement from you. Not the full testimony. That comes later. But a sworn statement, dated and signed, documenting what you witnessed in Grant's survey files and what you observed regarding Cade's visits. Something the judge can hold in her hand. I can write it tonight. I know you can. He said it simply, without the particular tone of surprise she'd gotten used to hearing when people realized she could do things they hadn't expected. She appreciated that about him. She stood up. I'll have it ready in an hour. He was already reaching for his pen. Make it 45 minutes. The fire burned itself out by 2 a.m. The structure was gone, 4 walls of charred timber and a collapsed roof. But the fence line had held, and the pasture beyond it was untouched. Grant came back into the kitchen, smelling of smoke with a burn on the back of his left hand that he was treating with the focused attention of someone determined not to make a production of it. She set the basin of cool water on the table without being asked and went back to the stove. He submerged his hand and said nothing for a moment. Denny saw the fire start, he said finally. He was up early. Stomach trouble, he said. He saw the light from his bunk window. By the time he got there, the roof was already going. He looked at his hand under the water. He thinks he saw a rider moving away to the south. One rider, fast. One man to set a fire, she said. One man is enough, with the right accelerant. Yes. He looked at the burn on his hand. It was going to blister, already starting. That's 20 tons of winter hay. I know. I can buy in. It'll cost more than it should, and the timing is bad, but I can do it. He wasn't telling her this to be consoled. He was working through the logistics out loud. The way she'd learned he processed damage. The structure itself, the walls were old anyway. I'll rebuild before winter. Grant. She turned from the stove. They know about the injunction. He looked up. Keen thinks someone may have communicated it to them before it was formally served. He's leaving for Helena at first light. She sat down across from him, the way she'd sat across from Keen an hour before, in the lamplight with the smell of smoke still threading through the air. This is going to get worse before it gets better. I know that, he said. Do you know how much worse? He held her gaze. Tell me what you think. She thought about the journal. About the section in the middle of the second half. The entries that documented what happened to property owners who became active adversaries rather than passive targets. 3 cases. In 2 of them, the escalation had stayed at the level of property damage. The third one, a rancher in Nebraska, name recorded as H. Caldwell, had ended differently. She had never let herself think too carefully about the third case. They burn what they can afford to lose, she said. The hay storage was valuable, but it's replaceable. They know that. This wasn't meant to destroy you, said. It was meant to communicate. She kept her voice even. The next thing they do will be something they calculate you can't recover from quickly. They'll go for something central, the operation itself, the cattle, the water rights, the main house. He was quiet. Or, she said, they go for something they think will make you stop fighting. She watched him understand what she meant. The people on the property, Noah, her. I want to send Noah somewhere, he said. Henderson Crossing, maybe. He has a school teacher there he likes. He won't go, she said. He'll go if I tell him to. He'll go, and he'll be miserable, and he'll find a way back within a week, she said. You know your nephew. Grant looked at his burned hand in the water. The set of his jaw was the tightest she'd seen it. Then I want someone with him at all times, one of the hands I trust. Rupert, she said. He's the one Noah already listens to. Rupert, he nodded. And you? I'm not going anywhere, she said. We've had this conversation. That was before they lit my barn on fire. That's exactly when the conversation needs to stay the same, she said. If I leave, they win two things, the property and the evidence that can stop them doing this to the next ranch and the one after that. He looked at her for a long moment. You are the most stubborn person I have ever met, he said. He said it without anger, which made it land differently. I've had to be, she said. He took his hand out of the basin and looked at the burn. She got up, found the clean cloth and the salve she kept on the second kitchen shelf, and brought them to the table. He didn't protest while she bandaged it, which she understood as a form of trust from a man who generally preferred to deal with his own injuries in private. All right, he said when she was done. Then we do it together. We do it together, she said. Keene left at 5 in the morning before the sun was up, with a certified copy of the journal and Evelyn's signed statement folded inside his coat. Grant gave him his best road horse, not the most showy animal in the stable, but the most steady. The kind of horse that didn't startle and didn't tire and could be depended on to keep going when a lesser animal would have quit. She watched him ride out from the kitchen window with her second cup of coffee in her hand and thought about all the things that could go wrong in Helena and all the things that depended on them not going wrong, and then she made herself stop because the list was too long to be useful and the morning had enough actual problems without adding anticipated ones. The first actual problem arrived at 9 o'clock. Two men she didn't recognize rode up to the front gate, not to the door, just the gate, and stopped there. They didn't knock or announce themselves. They just sat their horses and looked at the house. Denny noticed them from the yard and came to the kitchen to tell her, and she went to the front window and looked at them and understood immediately what they were. Not Meridian's lawyers. Not surveyors. The other kind. She went to find Grant. He was in the barn, resetting the tool storage that had been displaced in the night's confusion. She told him quietly, and he came out and walked to the gate himself, unhurried, direct, the walk of a man on his own property. And she watched from the porch. She couldn't hear what was said. She watched Grant stand at the gate for approximately 2 minutes, say something short, and then come back to the house. The two men stayed at the gate for another 5 minutes. Then they rode south. They say they're here about a water rights matter, Grant said, coming up the porch steps. Said there's been a filing disputing my rights to the Eastern Creek. There's no water rights dispute, she said. Or there wasn't 3 days ago. There is now, filed apparently by a company called Clearwater Holdings. He looked at her. I've never heard of Clearwater Holdings. She had. It was in the journal. A subsidiary name, used when the Meridian interest wanted to obscure the source of a filing. A shell, registered in a different territory, operating under a different name, connected back to the central organization through a chain of paper transactions designed to take months to trace. It's them, she said. It's a second front. He sat down on the porch step, not defeated, just thinking in the way he thought, with his elbows on his knees and his gaze on the middle distance. First the survey boundaries, then the hay barn. Now the water rights. They're cutting around the property, she said. Boundaries from the south and west, water rights from the east. If they can cloud all three simultaneously, the legal challenge becomes something no single lawyer can manage alone. Even Keene. He was quiet for a moment. What do they want? In the end, what's the real goal? Blackthorn Valley, she said simply. The whole thing. 20,000 acres of the best grazing land in northern Montana with established water rights and a functioning cattle operation. She sat down on the step beside him, something she hadn't done before, close enough that the distance between them was the easy distance of people who had stopped measuring it. If they get you out, they'll subdivide and sell at 20 times what they force you to take. He absorbed that. All right, he said, then we need more than Keene. Yes. Who else? She had been thinking about this since the previous night. Since before, actually. Since the 3 days with Keene, when she'd understood that the scope of what they were dealing with exceeded a single legal strategy. The journal documented 36 ranches. The federal investigation that had been shelved 2 years ago had presumably reached a similar scope before someone applied pressure to shut it down, which meant the investigation existed, the evidence existed, and somewhere there was a federal investigator who had been removed from a case he hadn't wanted to leave. I need to write a letter, she said. He looked at her. There was a federal investigation, she said. Keene mentioned it. Initiated 2 years ago, shelved when the investigators were transferred. Being transferred from a case you didn't want to leave is a particular experience. I've found that people who've had that experience tend to stay interested in the subject, even without official backing. She looked at him. If I can find the name of the investigator who was removed and reach him directly, you'd be going around official channels. I've been going around official channels for 4 years, she said. I'm good at it. Something crossed his face. Not the almost humor she'd seen before, but the real thing, briefly. Write your letter, he said. Us. She wrote it that afternoon while the ranch functioned around her with the particular determination of people who refused to act like things were falling apart, even when things were falling apart. Denny repaired the south fence where the fire had scorched the lower rails. Stokes and another hand did a full water check on the eastern creek, documenting the current markers and conditions in a written record that Grant had the presence of mind to have them date and sign in front of him. Noah helped, because Noah always helped when given the choice, and she watched him through the window moving alongside the men with the unsentimental practicality of a child who had been raised on a working ranch and understood that work was the answer to most problems, even when it wasn't. She wrote the letter twice. The first draft was too long. She had a tendency, under stress, to over-explain, to provide more context than necessary because she had spent 4 years in situations where the full picture was the only thing that stood between her and disaster. She cut it back. The second draft was precise. Who she was, what she had, what she'd witnessed at Blackthorn Valley Ranch, and a single direct question about whether the investigation that had been removed from him 2 years ago was something he was still interested in finishing. She didn't know his name yet. She would need to ask Keene, which meant waiting for a message from Helena. She folded the letter and set it aside and went back to the kitchen, because supper needed to happen, and her hands were restless, and the waiting was always, always the hardest part. The message from Keene came 4 days later, carried by a writer she didn't recognize who turned out to be the son of Keene's Helena landlady, pressed into service because Keene didn't trust the regular mail. The message was short, in the cramped handwriting she'd learned to read. Judge has seen the injunction and the statement. Proceedings tentative for 3 weeks' time. Sooner if Meridian's legal response gives us cause to expedite. Authentication of journal document in progress through territorial archivist. Should be complete within 10 days. The investigator's name is Calvin Marsh. He was transferred to a customs post in Portland 2 years ago. He is not happy about it. She read it twice, then gave it to Grant. He read it and looked up. 3 weeks is a long time. It's faster than these things usually go, she said. Keene is pushing. What happens in 3 weeks on their end? They file responses. They challenge the injunction. They try to establish that their survey amendments are legitimate and ours are the anomaly. She sat down. What concerns me is the water rights filing. That goes to a different court on a different timeline. Even if the Helena injunction holds, Clearwater Holdings can continue the water case independently. The two proceedings don't automatically consolidate. He set the message down. Meaning they can lose the South Boundary fight and win the Eastern water rights fight and still cause enough damage to make operating this ranch unsustainable. Yes, she said, that's their fallback. It's in the journal. When primary survey manipulation fails, shift to resource rights. Water, grazing permits, mineral claims. The goal is to make the property legally ungovernable, even if ownership is retained. He was quiet for a while. She wrote the letter to Calvin Marsh that evening, with his name in the address and the full weight of everything she'd been carrying for 4 years behind each carefully chosen sentence. The second escalation came not as fire but as paper, which was in some ways more frightening. 10 days after the hay barn burned, Grant received a formal legal notice, served by an officer of the county, which meant it had the weight of official process behind it, informing him that Meridian Land Associates was initiating a boundary dispute proceeding in territorial court, citing the amended survey documentation that Evelyn had identified weeks ago in his own files. The notice was precise, professional, and cited 3 separate surveyor certifications that she knew were false. She read it over his shoulder at the kitchen table and felt the thing that the past weeks of waiting had been building toward click into place. This was the formal start. Everything before had been positioning: the letters, the visits, the fire, the water rights filing. This was the move they'd been building to. Now we know their timeline, she said. Territorial court proceeding in 42 days, Grant said. He was looking at the notice with an expression she read as something between anger and something that might, on another face, have looked like relief. The waiting had cost him too, in its way. 42 days to respond or default. We won't default. She straightened up. Keene's injunction is already filed. This proceeding has to acknowledge the existence of the Helena filing. It complicates their case. Does it stop it? No, she said honestly. But it slows it. He folded the notice and set it on the table. I'm going to ride to Henderson Crossing today. There's a man there, Albert Rowe, runs the hardware supply, who lost his grazing permit 3 years ago under circumstances that never sat right with him. I want to talk to him. She looked at him. You think he was a Meridian target? I think a man who had clear grazing rights for 15 years and lost them in a proceeding he couldn't explain has a story worth hearing. He was already standing. And if his story matches what's in that journal, we have a witness. She stood too. I want to come. It's a 4-hour ride. I've ridden worse. He looked at her for a moment, not assessing whether she could manage it, she thought, but something else. Something about what it meant that she was still here asking to come. 2 weeks after the barn fire, and with a legal notice on the table. Be ready in 20 minutes, he said. Albert Rowe was 61 years old, heavy-set, with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned not to rush things after a lifetime of being rushed. He ran his hardware supply from the back of a building that also housed a saddle repair shop, and on the second floor, a room he rented to travelers. He had a wife who brought them coffee without being asked, and then left the room with the practiced discretion of someone who had sat through a great many conversations she didn't want official knowledge of. He listened to Grant explain Paul briefly, with the precision of a man who had thought carefully about what to say, for about 10 minutes. Then he said, You have the journal. Not a question. Evelyn looked at him carefully. Why do you say that? Because you're sitting here talking to me instead of running. The only reason a person who knows what Meridian is doesn't run is because they have something that makes staying worth the risk. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. Horace Vane kept records. Everybody in the business knew he kept records. When he died, the people who knew about those records started looking for whoever had them. He looked at Evelyn. That's been going on for 4 years. Yes, she said. So you're her, he said, simply, without drama. Yes. He nodded slowly. I lost 400 acres. Best winter grazing I had. The survey they filed showed my eastern line 200 yards inside where it had been for 20 years. I had neighbors who could testify to where that line was. The county recorder said the survey was properly certified. He put his mug down. The county recorder was a man named Durant. He was replaced 8 months after my proceeding by a new man from Billings. Durant retired very suddenly at 44 years old and moved to a house in Colorado that nobody who knew him thought he could afford. Durant is in the journal, Evelyn said. He's listed as a paid correspondent, 13 transactions over 6 years. Rose sat with that for a moment. I'll testify to my own experience, what I saw, what I lost, how the proceeding ran. He looked at Grant. If you're building a case, you need people who lost things to put human faces on what those records document. Otherwise, it's just paper, and paper is what they're good at. It is, Grant said. Will you come to Helena? I will, Rose said, but I won't be the only one. There are 3 other men I know of in this county alone who had proceedings that didn't add up. If you give me 2 weeks, I'll have them at the same table." Evelyn looked at Grant. He looked at her. Something passed between them that didn't need words. Recognition, maybe. That the thing they'd been building in the kitchen and the office and the barn had just grown beyond the two of them in a way that felt, for the first time, like momentum. 2 weeks, Grant said. "We'll come back." They rode back to Blackthorn Valley in the long afternoon light, and for the first part of the ride, neither of them said much. She had learned that Grant's silences were not all the same. Some were the shutting down kind, some were the processing kind, and this one was the latter. She left him to it. It was nearly evening when he said, "Roe knew your name." "He knew of me," she said, "or of the person who had the journal. Not my name specifically. But he understood what you'd been doing for 4 years. "Yes." He was quiet for another stretch. "Does it feel different?" he said. "Now that someone besides me knows who you are and why you're here?" She considered that honestly. The morning she'd arrived in Silver Hollow felt like a long time ago, but when she reached back to it, the feeling was precise. The calculated anonymity of it, the careful construction of a person who had no past. Evelyn Mercer, with her forged references, and her suitcase with the false bottom, stepping off a train into a town she'd chosen with her eyes closed. "Yes," she said. "It feels different." "Better or worse?" She thought about it. "Both," she said. "But mostly better." He nodded. That was all. But there was something in the way he was riding, easier, she thought, than he'd ridden in the past 2 weeks. The particular ease of a man who had spent a long time doing things alone and was slowly, imperfectly, becoming accustomed to the fact that he wasn't doing this one alone. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't either. The ranch came into view as the sun dropped behind the western hills, and the house with its wide porch and its repaired railing, and the kitchen garden she'd brought back from weeds sat in the amber light, looking like what it had slowly, imperfectly become over the past 2 months. Something she did not want to leave. She had stopped counting the days since she'd last thought about where she'd go next. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. Somewhere between the root cellar and the barn, between Noah in the garden and Grant at the fence, between the journal on the kitchen table and a floorboard that lifted up. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, she had stopped. Calvin Marsh's response arrived 12 days after she sent the letter, from Portland, Oregon, in handwriting that was angular and compressed and covered both sides of 3 sheets of paper. He had not been happy in Portland. He had not stopped working the case, not officially, not with any authorization, but with the particular stubbornness of a man who had been handed a responsibility and then had it taken away before he'd done anything with it. He had names. He had records. He had the testimony of a former Meridian surveyor who had left the organization 2 years ago and been too frightened to come forward without someone to come forward to. He was on a train east within the week, his letter said. He was ready to finish what he'd started. She read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning, with the coffee getting cold and the sound of the ranch waking up around her, and she felt the accumulation of everything: the journal, Keene's filing, Roe and his 2 weeks of gathering, Marsh on a train from Portland, settle into something that had the shape of a real thing, not victory. She was too careful for that word, too familiar with how fast things that looked like victories could unravel, but the shape of something that could become one, if they held it together long enough. She folded Marsh's letter and put it inside her coat. Outside, Noah was crossing the yard with Rupert, the boy's voice carrying in the morning air as he argued some point about the best approach to fixing the water trough. Rupert listening with his characteristic unhurried patience, and then saying something short that made Noah stop and reconsider. She watched them for a moment. Then she went to find Grant, because there was work to do, and they were not done yet, and the 42 days on the notice were ticking down, and the man from Portland was on a train, and somewhere in Helena a judge had a journal in her hands that documented 36 ranches, and the families who'd lost them. It was enough, Evelyn thought, to keep fighting for. It was more than enough to keep standing still. Calvin Marsh was not what she'd built him into in her imagination, which was probably her own fault for building anything at all. She had pictured someone angular and driven, the kind of federal investigator who wore his dedication like a second coat. The man who stepped off the Henderson Crossing stage on a Wednesday afternoon was 53, soft around the middle, with a gray mustache that needed attention and the particular look of someone who had spent 2 years doing work he found beneath him and had not made peace with it. He carried one bag and a leather satchel so full it wouldn't close properly, and he shook her hand before he shook Grant's, which told her he'd read her letter more carefully than most people read anything. "Miss Mercer," he said, "the journal is authentic?" "The territorial archivist in Helena confirmed it 10 days ago," she said. "Keene has the certification." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. "And you've been on this property how long?" 3 months. He looked at the house, then at the burned footprint of the hay storage, the charred foundation still visible, the new structure going up beside it, half-framed in fresh pine. Grant had started rebuilding 12 days ago, before the legal proceedings were resolved, because waiting on the legal proceedings to tell him whether his ranch was still his had struck him as the wrong way to live. She had agreed with that. 3 months, Marsh repeated. "And in that time you identified the survey alterations, made contact with a territorial attorney, filed for injunction, located a secondary witness network, and reached me." He looked at her with the flat assessment of a man who had spent a career evaluating what people were actually capable of. "Someone should have found you 2 years ago." "I wasn't ready to be found 2 years ago," she said. He accepted that without comment, picked up his bag, and followed Grant into the house. The 4 days that Marsh spent at Blackthorn Valley Ranch were the most concentrated period of work she had experienced since the 3 days with Keene, and they were harder because Marsh was harder. He asked questions Keene hadn't thought to ask, pushed on answers she'd given that she'd thought were complete, and twice told her that something she considered solid evidence was inadmissible in the form she'd presented it, and walked her through why and what form would work instead. He was not unkind about it. He was simply not interested in what was almost sufficient. On the second evening, they sat at the kitchen table after supper. Grant, Keene, who had returned from Helena, Marsh, and Evelyn, and Marsh laid out what he had brought from Portland. The former Meridian surveyor's name was Gerald Pruitt. He had worked for the organization for 9 years, primarily in the Northern Territories, and he had left after a property dispute in Wyoming that had resulted in a family being removed from land they'd held for 20 years. He had come to Marsh 2 years ago, frightened enough that he'd asked for a meeting in a post office vestibule in Portland and kept looking at the door the whole time. He had given Marsh enough to build a case. Marsh had started building it. Then the transfer came. "Pruitt is willing to testify," Marsh said. "He's been willing for 2 years. He needed someone to testify to." "He'll come to Helena?" Keene asked. "He's already in Montana. I sent word before I left Portland." Evelyn looked at Marsh. "You sent word before you knew whether we had enough to move forward?" "I had your letter," he said. "That was enough to know we were moving forward." She looked at the table. There was something in that, in being taken at her word so completely by someone who had no reason to trust her beyond 3 sheets of paper, that she didn't entirely know what to do with. "The Clearwater Holdings water rights filing," she said, because she needed to stay on the work. "That's the piece Keene's injunction doesn't fully address." "I know." Marsh pulled a document from the satchel. "Clearwater Holdings is registered in Colorado under a principal named James Whitfield. Whitfield is a lawyer who has represented Meridian Land Associates in 7 prior proceedings under 3 different subsidiary names." He set the document on the table. "The water rights filing is fraudulent on its face if you can establish the subsidiary connection, which we can, through Pruitt's testimony and 3 separate corporate registration records I obtained in Portland." He paused. "The water case and the boundary case need to be heard together. I've been in contact with a federal circuit judge who has jurisdiction to consolidate them." Keene straightened. "You've already contacted the circuit court?" 2 weeks ago, Marsh said, "before I left Portland. I've been building this case for 2 years, Keene. I just didn't have the center of it." He looked at Evelyn. "Now I do." She thought about the journal in the floor of the office. She thought about Horace Vane, dead in what may or may not have been an accident, meticulous in his record-keeping right up until the end. She thought about the note in the composition book behind the canning jars, the previous housekeeper's shaky handwriting. "Tell Mr. Walker the Western Boundary Survey is wrong. I heard them talking. Someone had always been trying to warn someone. The warnings had just never had what they needed to land." "When does it move to hearing?" Grant asked. He had been quieter than usual through Marsh's presentation, the way he got quiet when he was doing intensive computation. Not withdrawn, just internal. 30 days, said, possibly less, if Meridian's legal response gives us grounds to expedite. Grant nodded once. One more thing, Marsh said. He looked at Evelyn. You'll testify under your full legal name in a federal proceeding. Once that happens, there's no going back to any version of quiet. I know, she said, and you're prepared for that. She looked at Grant. He was already looking at her, in the way he'd been looking at her more often lately. Not the measuring look of the first day, not the complicated look of the barn, but the simpler, more direct look of a man who had stopped pretending he didn't know what he was looking at. Yes, she said. I'm prepared. The hearing was held in Helena on a morning in late October when the first real cold of the season had come down from the north, and the streets of the capital were the particular gray gold of a place that understood winter was no longer hypothetical. She had been to Helena once before, passing through on a train 3 years ago, not stopping, not looking out the window for longer than necessary. She had not imagined coming back. The federal courthouse was a stone building on the main street with wide steps and tall windows, and she climbed those steps between Grant on her left and Keene on her right, with Marsh already inside and Albert Rowe waiting in the corridor with 2 other men she'd met once in Henderson Crossing. Both of them ranchers, both of them with stories that matched the journal's pattern in ways that a jury would understand in their bones, even before Marsh explained the legal framework. She was not calm. She had stopped pretending to be calm to herself, which felt like a private form of progress. Her hands were steady because she'd trained them to be, but underneath the steadiness, her whole body was doing something that she'd learned to think of as the price of deciding to be somewhere. You paid for stillness. That was what 4 years of running had taught her. Moving felt like it cost nothing because the cost was deferred. Stopping cost everything up front, all at once, and you just had to hold on while it hit you. She held on. The hearing lasted 2 days. Marsh presented the journal first, authenticated, certified, entered into the federal record, and walked the court through its contents with the patient, methodical precision of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for 2 years. Keene handled the territorial injunction proceedings and the survey fraud documentation. Pruitt testified for 4 hours on the second morning in the flat, factual voice of a man who had made his decision and was not going to let fear walk him back from it. And she watched the faces of the court as he described 9 years of work for the Meridian interest, named names, described payments, walked through the process by which survey stakes were moved and records were altered and county officials were compensated for their flexibility. When it was her turn, she sat in the chair and gave her name, her full, real name, Evelyn Ann Mercer, and answered every question Marsh asked her and every question opposing counsel asked her, and she did not look away from anything. Opposing counsel tried to establish that the journal was stolen property and therefore inadmissible. Keene had anticipated this. The argument failed on the grounds that evidence of criminal conspiracy was not protected property under the relevant statutes. Opposing counsel tried to establish that her 4 years of concealment demonstrated she could not be trusted as a credible witness. She answered that question directly. She had been afraid, and afraid people did not always do the most effective thing, and she was here now. That was the choice she could control. She did not think she was eloquent. She thought she was accurate, which she had come to believe mattered more. When it was done, when the second day ended and the judge had the record and the room began to empty, she sat in the chair for a moment longer than necessary. Not because she was collecting herself, though she was, because she was trying to understand what had just happened, and the thing about finally doing the thing you'd been carrying for 4 years was that it didn't feel the way you imagined it would. It felt smaller and larger at the same time, in a way she didn't have precise words for. Grant was waiting in the corridor. He didn't say anything when she came out. He just fell into step beside her, and that was exactly right. The federal court's ruling came 3 weeks later. Keene read it to them at the kitchen table, the same table where everything had started, where the journal had first been opened, where Marsh had laid out his documents, where Noah had sat in the lamplight months ago and told her about 2 men at the fence and changed the direction of everything. The Meridian Land Associates' boundary proceedings against Blackthorn Valley Ranch were dismissed. The fraudulent survey amendments were vacated and ordered stricken from the territorial record. The Clearwater Holdings water rights filing was consolidated into the federal case and dismissed on the grounds of fraudulent origin. Thomas Cade was named as a defendant in the federal criminal proceeding, along with 6 other individuals, including the former county recorder Durant, 3 certified surveyors, and 2 officers of Meridian Land Associates. Keene kept reading. The ruling addressed the broader case, the 36 documented properties, the pattern of fraud across 6 territories. It ordered the federal investigation formally reopened and expanded, with Marsh appointed as lead investigator. It recommended that property owners who could demonstrate loss through documented Meridian interference file for restitution through a newly established territorial claims process. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Albert Rowe gets his 400 acres back? Grant said. If he files through the claims process, Keene said. It won't be immediate, but yes. Grant nodded. Something moved across his face, not relief, or not only that, something that looked more like the settling of a weight he'd been holding at arm's length for long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like not to hold it. Noah said, "So they can't take the ranch?" "No," Grant said. "They can't take the ranch." The boy sat with that for a moment. Then he got up from the table, said something about checking the foal, who was now 5 months old and entirely too confident for an animal that had recently learned to walk, and left, which was how Noah processed large things. He walked away from them until they were small enough to carry. She watched him go. Keene excused himself to write letters. Marsh had already returned to Helena to begin the reopened investigation. The kitchen settled around them the way it settled every evening. The sounds of the ranch at dusk, the last of the light through the window, the particular domestic quiet of a place where the day's work was done. Grant was still at the table. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down. He picked it up. They didn't say anything for a while. "Roe and the others," he said finally. "They'll get something back. Maybe not everything." "Probably not everything," she agreed, "but something." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "It's not the same as it not having happened." "No," he said. "It's not." She had thought about this, about the difference between justice and repair, about what it meant to win a case that documented 36 losses. The law could restore boundaries and vacate fraudulent filings. It could not give back the years spent fighting or the years spent not knowing what had been done to you. It could not give back the ranches that had already been sold under duress before the process reached them, or the families that had scattered when the land went. This was not a story with a clean ending. She had known that before she testified. She had known it before she arrived at Blackthorn Valley, if she was honest, known it the night she walked out of Vane's house with a journal that documented every way the law could be bent to strip people of what they'd built. What the law could do was stop it from happening to the next 36. That had to be enough. And it was. She found the composition notebook a week after the ruling. She'd been reorganizing the pantry. There were always things to reorganize in a house where 4 years of minimal maintenance had layered disorder under every surface. And she moved a row of canning jars, and there it was, exactly where she'd found it the first time. She'd returned it to the same spot months ago, not sure what else to do with it. She took it down and opened it to the last page. "Tell Mr. Walker the Western Boundary Survey is wrong. I heard them talking. The numbers don't match what he was told. He needs to know before it's too late." She stood in the pantry for a moment. The woman who had written this note had left in April. She had heard something, written a warning that she didn't know how to deliver, and then done what people did when they were alone with information they couldn't use. She had left. Evelyn did not blame her. She understood that particular calculation exactly. The cost-benefit of staying when you were alone with something dangerous was almost never worth it. What had changed, she thought, was not the danger. The danger had been just as real in April as it was in August when she'd found this notebook. What had changed was that the danger wasn't hers alone to carry anymore. She closed the notebook and put it in her apron pocket. She would give it to Marsh for the investigation record. It was evidence of when the surveillance of the property had begun, and that mattered for the criminal case against Cade and the others. But she stood there a moment longer and thought about the woman who had written it, whose name she'd learned was Clara Hollis, who had since taken a position in a boarding house in Butte. She thought about writing her a letter, to tell her that the warning she'd tried to give had arrived, eventually, through different hands, that the western boundary was intact, that the ranch was fine. She thought she would write it. It seemed like the kind of thing that mattered, even if it was small. On a Saturday in November, when the first real snow had come and the valley was the particular white-gray of early Montana winter, Grant Walker asked her to stay. Not as the cook, not as the person who knew what was in this journal and how to use it, not under any terms that fit neatly into a category. He asked her in the kitchen, which was where most things that mattered at Blackthorn Valley had happened, in the plain language of a man who found plain language harder than most things and was using it anyway. "I'm not good at this," he said, which was the most honest opening she'd ever heard from anyone on any subject. "I know," she said. "I'm better than I was in April," he said. "Noah says I was unbearable in April." "Noah is perceptive," she said. He looked at his coffee mug. "I don't know what this looks like exactly. Going forward, I know what the ranch looks like and what the work looks like and what next spring looks like. The rest of it," he stopped. "I'm working on the rest of it." She looked at him. This man who had stood in a root cellar with a ruined potato in his hand and said he didn't sleep well in new places either, who had stayed at the garden fence in the amber light and said "we" without noticing, who had not made her feel like a problem to be managed or a complication to be weighed, but like someone whose particular weight was one he'd decided was worth standing next to. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I told you that." "That was about the journal," he said. "No," she said. "It wasn't." She looked at him directly. "It wasn't about the journal even when I said it was." He looked at her for a long moment in the way he had that she'd spent months learning to read. Then he nodded, once, with the small finality he brought to things he'd decided. "All right," he said. She turned back to the stove because the porridge was going to scorch, and because some things didn't need to be extended past the point where they'd said what they needed to say. But she was smiling, and she didn't try to stop it. Spring came slowly, the way it always came in northern Montana, grudging, incremental, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, and the valley floor holding on to cold long past, when the hills had let it go. The new hay storage was finished before the worst of winter, rebuilt better than the original. Grant had a tendency to rebuild things better than the original, she'd noticed, which was either stubbornness or optimism, and she suspected it was both. The Eastern Creek ran clear and unchallenged, the fraudulent water rights filing a vacated document in a federal record that Marsh's investigation had since expanded into 4 territories. Thomas Cade entered a guilty plea in February. Durant followed in March. The criminal proceedings against the remaining defendants were ongoing, which meant the story was not done. These things were never cleanly done. But the structure that had threatened 36 ranches across 6 territories was broken at its center, and the people who had run it were answering for it in courts that had not been reached by their money. Albert Rowe's 400 acres were restored in March, through the restitution process that Keene had helped establish. He rode out to the ranch to tell them in person, which Evelyn thought said something about the man. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and was not effusive about it, because he was not an effusive man, but there was something in his face she recognized. The look of someone who had stopped expecting something for long enough that receiving it required a moment of adjustment. She understood that look well. Noah turned 10 in April. The foal, now a genuinely arrogant yearling named something that Noah had decided should not be shared with adults, had developed a habit of following the boy around the pasture in a way that the ranch hands pretended not to find entertaining. Rupert had taught Noah 3 new knots and was working on a 4th. The kitchen garden was planned, the seeds ordered, the beds turned and ready. She stood in the garden on a morning in late April when the air was cold still, but the ground was softening, and she looked at the house. The repaired railing, the straight shutters, the smoke from the kitchen chimney going straight up in the still air, and she felt the particular weight of a moment that was too ordinary to mark and too significant to ignore. She had not found this place because she was brave. She had found it because she was tired and had put her finger on a map and had needed somewhere small enough to disappear. She had stayed not because she had planned to stay, but because the staying had accumulated, quietly, the way most real things accumulated without announcing themselves until they were already part of you. The journal that had cost her 4 years of her life was now the centerpiece of a federal investigation that had, by Marsh's last count, opened inquiries into 11 additional properties across 4 territories. She had given 2 more sworn depositions since the October hearing. She would likely give more. The work of undoing what the Meridian interest had done was going to outlast the immediate crisis by years. That was the nature of things built on fraud, that unwinding them took longer than building them had. She was not done with it. She had understood, sometime in the winter, that she would not be done with it for a long time, and that was all right. She had spent 4 years treating the journal as a burden she was waiting to put down. She understood now that it was not a burden, it was work. There was a difference. Burdens you carried until you could drop them. Work you chose to keep doing because it was worth doing. She was still choosing. Grant came out of the barn and crossed the yard in her direction, the particular unhurried walk she had memorized without intending to, and he stopped at the garden fence and looked at the beds she'd been turning. "Carrots again?" he said. "And the beans. And I want to try tomatoes this year on the south wall. There's enough reflected heat if I start them inside in March." "You're thinking about March and April." "I'm always thinking about the next season," she said. "It's a kitchen habit." He leaned on the fence post. "Keene writes that the circuit court is expanding the Meridian case into Wyoming." "I know. He wrote me too." He looked at her. "Are you going to be called back to Helena?" "Probably. In the summer, he thinks." She turned another section of soil. "You'll survive a week without a cook." "That's not what I meant," he said. She looked up. He was watching her in the direct, uncomplicated way that still occasionally caught her off guard, even now, because she had spent 4 years training herself to expect to be watched with suspicion and had not entirely unlearned it. "I know," she said. "I'll come back." He nodded. That was enough. It was always enough between them. The plain statement, the plain acknowledgement, without the ornament that neither of them was particularly built for anyway. She thought about what she might have said 4 years ago if someone had told her that the journal would end up here, not dropped in a river or burned in a field or handed off to someone braver, but used, properly used, in a courtroom in Helena with her own voice reading it into the federal record. She thought she would not have believed it. She thought that version of herself standing in vain study with the discovered document in her hands, and terror moving through her like cold water, could not have imagined choosing to stand still. But that was the thing about choices made under fear. You couldn't always see them from inside the fear. You could only see them from the other side. The other side looked like a kitchen garden in April. It looked like a boy arguing with a yearling horse. It looked like a man leaning on a fence post, asking about March, in the plain language of someone who had started thinking about next season too. It was not a perfect life. She had not arrived at something perfect. The fraud case would run for years. Her name would appear in federal documents in ways that could not be called quiet. She still woke sometimes in the dark with the old reflex, the calculation of exits, the weight of the suitcase, the question of where next, and had to remind herself that the question had been answered. The answer was here. It was this valley, this house, this work, this man, this boy, this garden. She had not found safety because she found a place to hide. She had found it because she finally stayed in one place long enough to build something that was actually worth protecting. And the thing about something worth protecting, she had learned, was that you stopped needing to run from everything else. She turned another row of soil. The smoke from the kitchen chimney went straight up in the still morning air. Spring was coming, slow and certain, the way